top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russia starts drills with intercontinental ballistic missiles. Russian whose daughter drew anti-war picture gets 2 years jail term but flees. Plus, North Korea unveils new Hasin-31 nuclear warhead right after simulating airburst with 2 tactical ballistic missiles. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Russia Defense Ministry says Moscow began exercises with the Yars intercontinental ballistic missile system and several thousands of troops in what is likely to be seen as another attempt by Moscow to show off its nuclear strength. President Vladimir Putin has aimed to make the Yars missile system, which replaced the Topol system, part of Russia's invincible weapons and the mainstay of the ground-based component of its nuclear arsenal. The drills involving the Strategic Missile Forces Comprehensive Control checking up the arms missile formation together with a command and staff exercise with the Novosibirsk missile formation equipped with the Yars system. The ministry adds that during the exercises, the Yars mobile systems will conduct maneuvers in 3 Russian regions. Meanwhile, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited arms factories in Russia's Chelyabinsk and Kirov regions. According to the Defense Ministry, Shoigu inspected facilities directly involved in the production of military produce, mainly large-caliber ammunition, for use in what Russia calls its special military operation in Ukraine. The defense minister was shown automated production lines making artillery, tank and mortar shells of various calibers and unguided aircraft missiles, as well as areas for quality control of product. During the trip, Shoigu was reportedly told that arms production will be increased 7 or 5 times by the end of this year. In the meantime, a Russian who was investigated by police after his daughter drew an anti-war picture at school has been sentenced to 2 years in a penal colony on charges of discrediting the armed forces. But a court spokesperson says the man, whose name is Alexei Moskalev, had escaped house arrest overnight. His whereabouts are not known. Moskalev has been separated from his daughter, Masha, since he was placed under house arrest at the start of this month, and she was moved to a children's home in their hometown of Yermov, south of Moscow. The case has provoked an outcry amongst Russian human rights activists and sparked online campaign to reunite father and daughter. Moskalev was convicted over comments he himself had posted online about the war in Ukraine. But the investigation started after his 12-year-old daughter drew a picture last April showing Russian missiles raining down on a Ukrainian mother and child, prompting the head of the school to call the police. U.S. President Joe Biden says he was concerned about the possibility that Russia will send tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. Speaking to reporters at the White House, Mr. Biden says they haven't done that yet. That's dangerous kind of talk he's using, and it's worrisome. Russian President Vladimir Putin says Russia had struck a deal with neighboring Belarus to station tactical nuclear weapons on its territory. Belarus confirmed it will host Russian tactical nuclear weapons, saying the decision was a response to years of Western pressure, including sanctions and what is said was a military buildup by NATO members near its borders. Although Putin did not say when the deployment will take place, the announcement appeared to pave the way for Moscow's first deployment of nuclear weapons outside its borders since the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, Poland's prime minister says Belarus will certainly face further sanctions from Europe due to the Russian plan to station those tactical nuclear weapons in the country as tensions between Warsaw and Minsk hit new dimensions. He says he was in daily talks with other European Union leaders about the 11th package of sanctions against Russia, and that it will include more measures targeting Belarus, a close ally of Moscow.
Ten krok, na który zdecydowała się Rosja, czyli
This step taken by Russia, which for now is an announcement of the deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus, will certainly lead to the announcement of additional sanctions. The level of sanctions will be much more severe for Lukashenko regime. We border directly with Belarus, and therefore in Poland, we are considering tightening the parameters of passenger and freight traffic as part of our bilateral relations in order to send a clear signal to Lukashenko that we do not accept sanctions that serve Russia in its aggressive actions in Ukraine and its aggressive actions against Poland and against other EU countries.
On the other hand, Japan's Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi says that Tokyo will stay vigilant against Moscow's military operations after Russia's Navy fired supersonic anti-ship missiles at a mock target in the Sea of Japan. The P-270 Musket missile, which has the NATO reporting name of SSN-23 Sunburn, is a medium-range supersonic cruise missile of Soviet origin capable of destroying a ship within a range of up to 120 kilometers. The firing of the missiles comes a week after two Russian strategic bomber planes capable of carrying nuclear weapons flew over the Sea of Japan for more than 7 hours in what Moscow said was a planned flight.
We are aware that the Russian Ministry of Defense announced on March 28 that missile ships of the Pacific Fleet conducted cruise missile launch training in the Sea of Japan. As Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues, Russian forces are also becoming more active in the Far East, including Japan's vicinities. The Japanese government will continue to monitor these movements of the Russian military.
In another development, North Korea's state-run broadcaster KRT released still photographs of nuclear warheads dubbed the Hasan-31 during leader Kim Jong-un's visit to the Nuclear Weapons Institute. Kim inspected new tactical nuclear weapons and technology for mounting warheads on ballistic missiles, as well as nuclear counterattack operation plans. He ordered the production of weapons-grade material in a far-sighted way to boost its nuclear arsenal exponentially and produce powerful weapons. North Korea's military also simulated a nuclear airburst with two tactical ballistic missiles on Monday, and tested underwater strategic weapons systems again from March 25th to the 27th. North Korea has been ramping up tension, firing short-range ballistic missiles and conducting nuclear counterattack simulation last week against the United States and South Korea, which is accused of rehearsing an invasion with their military exercises. Now, we'd like to speak with Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, and editor at the Odessa Review, who joins us from Kiev. Mr. Dickinson, it's good to see you again. Welcome to the program this morning.
Good to join you. Good morning.
Could we start very quickly with the Ukraine and Japan in what is seen as in the Sea of Japan by Russia, I beg your pardon. Do you see this as just trying to provoke Japan because Japan is on the side of Ukraine? Why is Russia doing this?
Well, the Japanese Prime Minister was recently in Kiev. He visited Kiev at the same time as the Chinese leader was in Moscow. So it was a very calculated moment of political symbolism, as it were, to come to Kiev at this time and to demonstrate Japanese support for Ukraine. So one would assume that Russia was sending a similarly symbolic message back to Japan, saying your support for Ukraine may have costs, or perhaps simply do not take us lightly. I think it doesn't indicate any sort of military escalation, but it certainly is an attempt to send a message to Tokyo that Russia is not happy with the Japanese position and is watching the situation closely.
Now, this display to show its nuclear strength, as it's been alluded, of the intercontinental ballistic missile systems, what do you make of this now that there seems to be no let-up in this show of force on the part of Russia?
Well, the most recent comments from President Putin, the threat or the commitment to deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus is actually being seen by many in Ukraine as a sign of weakness, as a sign of Russia's weakening position, that they really have very little else to offer at this stage. Russia has been attempting to stage a major offensive in Ukraine for the last month or two, beginning in late January. They have very, very little to show for that. They've advanced a matter of their advance can be counted in terms of streets and meters rather than towns and kilometers, let's put it that way. Very little advance, very, very high casualties. So, and this is with a large deployment. This is after the mobilization of 300,000 new soldiers who've been deployed largely to Ukraine. So there is a sense in Ukraine that Russia has very little offensive capability at the moment on the ground in Ukraine. The West is increasing its military support for Ukraine. In recent months, we've seen the commitment to deliver and already the beginning of deliveries of armored vehicles, of tanks, and of jet planes, fighter jets. So clearly the West is increasing its support. So at this stage, Russia is in a position where it doesn't have the capability to move forward on the ground. The West is increasing its support. So Russia is reduced to simply, again, waving its nuclear weapons and saying, we still have nukes, you must take us seriously. The question now is, how seriously are they being taken by the West? I would suggest that every time they use this intimidation tactic, it is less and less effective.
The problem I have with that, Mr. Dickinson, and which a school of thought maybe has with that, is that if you're of the view that Russia has expended its attempts in trying to invade Ukraine militarily on the ground and now has to resort to nuclear threats, is it true, in your estimation, that Russia has indeed expended all it can militarily, infantry-wise or otherwise, against Ukraine?
Well, certainly Russia is a country with massive resources, and so one would assume that they will not turn around and stop anytime soon. Nobody expects the war to end soon, unfortunately, and Russia can continue to mobilize people almost limitlessly. There are millions and millions of people who can be mobilized. The expectation is there will be further mobilizations. So we're not talking about an imminent collapse or an end of Russian military potential entirely. The question is, how capable will they be to advance against quite a sophisticated and increasingly well-armed Ukrainian military? That's the question. So they can certainly continue the war for a long time, given the resources they have. The question is, can they advance? Can they reach their goals militarily with a largely conscript force which is forced to fight? with increasingly outdated weapons. There are reports in recent weeks, for example, that Russia has been bringing tanks out of storage that were manufactured in the 1950s, the 70-year-old tanks that actually date back to the Stalin era, almost World War II. Of course, Russia has a lot of sophisticated weapons as well, but this gives an impression of the scale of the losses they've suffered. Independent researchers who monitor visually confirmed losses, so not Ukrainian claimed losses of Russia, but visually confirmed by video or photo evidence, have announced this week that Russia has now lost more than 1,900 tanks in Ukraine, which is an incredible figure. Clearly that would impact on the military capability of any power.
Speaking of tanks, it's good that you brought this up. We know that we have Ukrainian military personnel coming back from the UK, having been trained in the use of the Challenger, beg your pardon, tanks, and we know that that being done, they're also getting tanks from Germany. You've mentioned how obsolete it's rumored that some of the Russian tanks are, but we have some of these tank operators or military personnel or soldiers now from the Ukraine who used to be, for instance, one was a factory tractor driver, and then he's now driving a Ukraine military tank donated by the UK. We can't question the resolute will of the Ukrainians, but as far as being battle tested, are there concerns on your part that some of the soldiers who've been trained in this crash course of tank drills will be able to come up to speed?
Yes, certainly. At this point, it's an unknown quantity. We don't know. We will only know in the coming weeks when Ukraine is expected to launch a major offensive. At this stage, it's purely speculation. We cannot say. And of course, I think you're right to raise this issue. It could be the case that some of these units will not be effective or will not be fully battle ready because of because of their lack of experience. They are going through very intense and very concentrated periods of training. What would normally take in a peacetime environment perhaps 6 months is being condensed into weeks. So, of course, the Ukrainians are extremely motivated. The reports we are seeing from Britain and from other places where they are training in different types of weapons are almost universal in their praise for the Ukrainians, saying they're very skilled, they're very motivated, they're very eager to learn. But of course, those factors might not necessarily be enough. When they go into battle, are they going to be ready? Well, we'll have to wait and see. Certainly, there's no question at this stage about the military technologies that have been provided up to this point. Ukraine has proved very effective at deploying those weapons, the missile systems they've received, the artillery systems they've received, the anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. But we are about to see, we expect, a major, probably the biggest Ukrainian offensive of the war, which will involve a lot of new technologies, a lot of tanks, a lot of armoured vehicles that haven't been used before. So it's really a leap into the unknown. We don't know exactly how this is going to play out.
Which leads me, of course, again to the nuclear rhetoric being peddled by Russia, to which President Joe Biden of the United States has just said that it's worrisome to him, after priorly the U.S. Foreign Office saying they don't think that's going to happen. But as far as deterrents go, international organizations, take for instance the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, have said that they're going to recommend, or indeed they have already recommended, that Russian athletes will be able to perform under a neutral flag, as well as Belarus athletes under a neutral flag, while they're keeping mum about the Olympics 2024. But it seems to me they're caught between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, they're trying to maintain the IOC's position to support the Russian and Belarusian athletes who do not support the war, thereby being independent, and at the same time not wanting to run afoul of the international community who support Ukraine. What more can international organizations do to send Russia a very strong signal?
the Olympic issue is in many ways a test case. It's the news of the recent days that Russian and Belarusian athletes will be allowed to compete under a neutral flag has been met with great with dismay and concern in Ukraine, specifically because it's seen as setting a precedent of normalization. The fear in Ukraine is that this will allow other international organizations to also make similar decisions and say, well, okay, we're going to normalize relationship with Russia, which in turn effectively risks normalizing the war, saying, okay, this is we accept this as something we maybe don't approve of, but I've come to terms with. That's the fear, certainly from the Ukrainian side. What Ukraine would like to see is a much tougher stance, is Russia being isolated to the maximum, not to be allowed to participate in the international community, essentially, in the sporting arena, in the cultural arena, in the business arena. So to maximise sanctions in all areas. But then, of course, that doesn't necessarily meet with the requirements or the vision of international organisations. So at this stage, the Olympic message is quite clear. They will, it seems, allow Russians to compete under a neutral flag. Will others follow on that? Well, we'll have to wait and see. But certainly the fear in Ukraine is that this sets a precedent of normalization that is a very worrying signal from the Ukrainian point of view.
Finally, Mr. Dickinson, there is talk from Zimbabwe in their foreign relations with Belarus of continuation of trade. I bring up Zimbabwe because there are other African countries as well, such as South Africa, who've not been as vocal against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Are you concerned about the message that African countries are sending in aligning or not aligning with the West against the Russian invasion?
Yes, I think to a high degree there is concern in Ukraine, and again, frustration, I think, would be a word I'd use as well. But a lot of African countries seem to be either maintaining a neutral position or offering some degree of sympathy for the Russian invasion. Ukrainians are particularly dismayed to see the apparent role played here by anti-Western sentiment, anti-colonial sentiment, the legacy of European colonial policies of the 19th and 20th centuries in Africa, and how they've played out, and particularly how Russia has exploited the role of the Soviet Union, which supported the liberation movements in Africa in the second half of the 20th century. And Russia is very actively trying to portray itself as an anti-colonial and anti-Western power, and that seems to resonate with a lot of people, with a lot of audiences in Africa. Now, Ukrainians say, hold on a minute, Russia is the biggest European imperial power today. Russia is still an imperial power, and the war in Ukraine is a classic colonial war. So if we're talking about anti-colonialism, if we're talking about liberation, the things that resonate and mean so much to a lot of African audiences, then hold on, that should bring support to Ukraine, which is essentially engaged in a liberation movement, in a war of independence against a colonial power which has been waging this war for the last year, but has been for centuries trying to oppress Ukraine.
A year and 2 months after, we hope that this comes to a quick end. Thank you so much for your perspectives on this issue, also concerning the last one and Africa. Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, and editor of the Odessa Review, thank you for your contributions this morning.
Thank you.
After the break, UN nuclear boss Rafael Grossi pushes for breakthrough to safeguard Zaporizhzhia plant. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Thank you for staying tuned and welcome back. Now, the head of the UN nuclear watchdog, Rafael Grossi, says his attempt to broker a deal to protect Ukraine's Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant was still alive, and he was adjusting the proposals to seek a breakthrough. Grossi has been pushing for a safety zone to be created at the plant to prevent a possible nuclear disaster, as Moscow and Kiev have accused each other of shelling the site of the power station since Russia invaded Ukraine in February last year.
We are making some adjustments on the proposals that we are putting on the table, and I'm confident that it might be possible to establish some form of protection, perhaps not emphasizing so much the idea of a zone, but on the protection itself, what people should do or shouldn't do to protect, instead of having a territorial concept. I'm not giving up in any way. I think, on the contrary, we need to multiply our efforts. We need to continue. If the reservoir level goes down beyond a certain level, then you don't have water to cool down the reactors. And we have seen, especially in January, that the levels of the water were going down significantly. They recovered somehow in the past few weeks. We had as an agreed route, and all of a sudden that route was not agreed anymore. One side was proposing a route, the other was proposing another route, and it took an awful lot of time to come to an agreement.
Britain and Poland have announced plans to build 2 temporary villages in Ukraine with housing for people who've been forced to flee their homes due to Russia's invasion. The UK government said in a statement announcing its new partnership with Warsaw that London pledged up to £10 million to provide shelter and power for more than 700 displaced Ukrainians. The statement said the 2 accommodation villages will be built in Lviv in western Ukraine and Poltava in the east, adding that the Allies will also provide £2.6 million worth of generators to support up to 450,000 people via schools, hospitals, and community centers in retaken and frontline areas including Kharkiv, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Mykolaiv, Odessa, and Kherson. The announcement comes as an ongoing Russian assault on Ukraine's energy infrastructure left millions of people without access to electricity, water, and central heating. A new Amnesty International report says that the invasion of Ukraine has exposed the double standards of human rights internationally, with the West adopting a tough response to Russia's war of aggression, while also maintaining a deafening silence on rights abuses around the world. The UK-based rights organization published its annual 2022 report on Tuesday, highlighting the state of human rights in 156 countries. Now, Agnes Kalamard, the Amnesty International Secretary General, her words say, "In 2022, we had the fantastic example of how the world came to support and show solidarity with the Ukrainian people. But we did not have a similar kind of support and solidarity for the Palestinian people, the people of Ethiopia, Myanmar, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was robust and welcomed, characterized by public denunciations and marked by strong calls against the many war crimes being committed." In March 2022, International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan said he was opening an investigation into alleged war crimes in Ukraine, dating as far back as a 2013 Maidan protest. Earlier this month, the ICC, International Criminal Court, issued an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin for allegedly committing war crimes in Ukraine. Now, we're pleased to speak with Dr. Humphrey Ojiako, former ambassador to Switzerland, joining us from Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory. You're welcome to the program this morning.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.
Now, because you are the former ambassador to Switzerland, I want to start from the Swiss position of neutrality concerning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian ambassador to Switzerland asking that they should in some way assist in weapons sharing. Now, I have a personal quaint fondness of the Swiss concept of neutrality. The Swiss, they're like in a domestic dispute, a family member that doesn't take sides. So on the one hand, it helps in the resolution of that dispute to have someone that is neutral and not partisan. On the other hand, if said dispute comes from a place of oppression and the oppressor is flagrantly doing evil, then the person who is neutral could be said to be in some way not supporting the good. Now, as far as Switzerland is concerned and their position of neutrality, is this something that, well, I know it can change, but how can Ukraine use this to their advantage?
Thank you for that question on neutrality. You know, the international, the global community has moved on from the strict concept of neutrality. Neutrality in a Cold War situation makes a lot of sense. When you might position yourself as an arbitrator or somebody who has a positive view of both sides' actions, and therefore you could be trusted to mediate between two quarreling people. But in a situation of a hot war, where, as you said, a lot of human rights issues are involved, as is the case in Ukraine, where whole cities are being wiped out. I listened to your news clip where Russia, for instance, has been targeting the energy access of Ukraine, rendering so many human beings living in a winter condition without heating, without water, without power. That does not call for neutrality in that kind of situation. It's simply copping out of responsibility. And I do not think that in this case, Switzerland's neutrality would be, okay, we don't need to escalate by providing any military assistance of any kind to either side. But that does not mean that in the United Nations conversations and discussions, decision-making on human rights issues concerning the war, issues on humanitarian law, of which Switzerland is actually the host country of the UN Human Rights Council. Switzerland cannot remain neutral. As for Ukraine taking advantage of anybody's neutrality, I don't think that is a question that is really totally strategic at this time, because we are talking of a situation here where there's talk of introducing tactical nuclear weapons, you know, and nobody, no country can remain neutral in that strict sense when the talk of use of nuclear assets in a war situation in the 21st century is being talked about. The countries there will not be safe, and Switzerland is not is not in Asia; it's in Europe. So that question actually is actually mute.
Because that reminds me, Mr. Ambassador, of what happened in the world wars, where because of that neutrality, German war criminals from the Gestapo and the Nazi party at the end of the war stashed their loot in Switzerland. So at the end of the day, it seems that it didn't work out well as far as human rights being upheld is concerned. And also, you recall, as I mentioned to our last guest, Zimbabwe is having dealings with Belarus, and every country has its rights to its own foreign policy. But for those African countries who are seemingly not neutral, but not vocal against Russia and are quite silent on the Russian invasion, what is your opinion?
But this is why we think that Nigeria should provide leadership in the direction that African countries go. If we are able to mobilize ECOWAS as a platform to move into the continental body, the AU, and they begin to take common positions on this. Every African country is vulnerable to sovereignty issues, to territorial integrity issues. So the question of Russia invading Ukraine in the context of African interests should be a slam dunk decision made to say no. You can't invade another sovereign country to disrupt its sovereignty and divide or invalidate its territorial integrity. So those African countries that are taking positions that seem to support Belarus, seem to support the Russian invasion, doing so probably on calculations of very short-term interests. I do not think that's the way Africa should be going. Mostly some depend on Russia for various things in their economy, in their own domestic security, and that probably leads to those decisions. But frankly speaking, I think the African continent should be going along the same line as the United Nations, following the UN Charter, following the AU Charter, and the various sub-regional charters that address these issues. We shouldn't depart from them, because the continent Africa is very vulnerable to such big power interventions. Who knows when it might resolve into something bigger than just mere intervention. So I don't think that's the way to go.
Yes, it's good you mentioned Nigeria's position and other African countries as well. The problem some people have with it is that whose side are you on? Indeed, if you will, are you definitely neutral, or you're definitely on the side of the Russian invasion, or you're definitely against?
In fact, I think like other aspects of foreign policy in recent years, Nigeria has followed a path that is not so very well defined. There is no path to coherence in Nigeria's foreign policy approaches, and Ukraine is not excluded. For example, when the UN held the first conference on Russia, Nigeria took the right position to say, no, you cannot invade another sovereign country and disrupt its territorial integrity, which is totally in agreement with the United Nations Charter, to which we are all signatories. But when it came to the human rights aspects, saying Russia cannot continue to be a bona fide member of the UN Human Rights Commission, if it is committing this kind of humanitarian crimes in the Ukraine, the typical example for which the world is taking a position is this deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. That is blatantly against the Geneva Conventions on Humanitarian Law and stuff like that. So Nigeria, ironically, or in a confusing kind of policy, decided to stay neutral on that. That is the decided no vote was the answer. That was confusing to some of us because who knows whose turn it might be. We do not think that what is happening in Ukraine is something a country like Nigeria should be neutral about, because we are very vulnerable to issues of national sovereignty and territorial integrity and the human rights of our own peoples, unless we are afraid that some of our own domestic policies are not upholding the human rights we committed to uphold. Then maybe we don't want all that to be thrown back at us.
Finally, sir, let me quickly draw your attention to the Amnesty International report, because I want to ask you this question: that is there a fine line between interfering with the sovereign foreign policies of nations, given their historical antecedents that led to those particular decisions, and outwardly condemning what is purportedly said to be negative or wrong? For instance, Amnesty International in their report said this, that we did not have a similar kind of support and solidarity, this is concerning Ukraine, for the Palestinian people, the people of Ethiopia, Myanmar, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was robust and welcomed. When you bring in, and this is for critics of Amnesty International, when you bring in nations like Israel, and you bring in the Palestinians, and you bring in Myanmar, you find that there are situations where the people in those countries have an antecedent that led to that particular situation, and condemning this or that or the other may not necessarily be in the best interest of the nation in question. We run out of time, so very quickly.
Let me say that international relations still remains a function of power, a function of interest. So yes, there is a lot of discrimination that occurs in the application of even international laws that should guide all of us. Just like you have in municipal law, somebody who can afford it, an important, influential, wealthy person, to hire sons, and his case is differently adjudged from that of a person who doesn't have the sort. So in the case of Ukraine, take a look at the array of Western powers that are directly interested in Ukraine because of NATO consideration, because of their own security interests. Ukraine being their immediate neighbors. When you compare this with the faraway Palestine and Israel, the Congo, Ethiopia, you see that the interests are not the same. So let's not lose sight of the fact. Yes, the ideal is that everybody should be treated the same way equally. But the reality of global life at the moment is that those who have the influence and power still tend to have their way most of the time. I suppose that's why Ukraine is getting a lot more attention than others. Another one could be this talk of use of nuclear weapons, not ballistic, but tactical or theater ballistic weapons, nuclear weapons. That could change the whole course of global relations, both for everybody, everywhere. So there has to be a lot of care in dealing with the Ukraine matter, because Russia may feel that at the moment that its military has been demystified, but it doesn't want that military to be humiliated, which is why, they are deploying these tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. So they didn't do this years.
Thank you so much, sir. Speaking with Dr. Humphrey Ojako, former ambassador to Switzerland, speaking to us from out of Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory. Many thanks for your perspective.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And when we return, Olympic Committee has recommended Russians and Belarusians be allowed to compete as neutrals amidst ongoing ban. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak says Russian oil sales to India surged more than 22-fold last year as the European buyers returned to other markets following the conflicts in Ukraine. Russia shifted its oil exports to India and China last year as European nations sought to end their reliance on Russian energy supplies after Moscow sent troops onto neighboring Ukraine. The EU imposed an embargo on seaborne Russian oil in December alongside a price cap on Russian crude that was agreed with a group of 7 industrialized powers. The shift has meant cheaper Russian energy imports for friendly countries, mainly China and India. Countries in the European Union have approved a landmark law that will ensure all new cars sold from 2035 must have zero emissions. Poland voted against the law, while Italy, Bulgaria, and Romania abstained. The agreement was delayed for weeks after Germany called for an exemption for cars running on e-fuels. E-fuels are argued to be carbon neutral because they use captured CO2, carbon dioxide emissions, to balance out the carbon dioxide released when the fuel is combusted in an engine. The new law had been expected to make it impossible to sell internal combustion engine cars in the EU from 2035. However, the exemption won by Germany will now help those with traditional vehicles, even though e-fuels are not yet produced at scale. And now we join our business correspondent and my colleague Inijon Mekwa for an added perspective to the war in Ukraine, because there's a business side to everything in life.
Yes, there is.
More threats to the dollar dominance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what you just read about the oil business, first of all. There's going to be an OPEC meeting on the 3rd of April, and guess what is top on the list of conversation there? It will be how countries like Russia, you know, they are part of the OPEC Plus, Russia and Saudi Arabia, who are majors when it comes to the trade of oil, how they can boycott the use of dollar. We do know that generally at this time, a lot of international commodities are priced in dollar, but things have started changing with the war. So if this goes through on the 3rd of April and giants like Saudi Arabia and Russia can trade or price their oil in another currency other than dollar, that means that the dollar may be losing its dominance. Already we've seen countries like China, like India, they already are dealing with themselves, you know, with their local currency. We've also seen India. India has now approved 18 central banks to open a kind of account that you deal with them in rupees, and you have African countries as part of those 18 countries. Tanzania, they're all part of it.
But is this feasible, Inni?
Is it feasible? People are already doing it. China is already doing it with Russia. India is already doing it with Russia. They're trading with themselves, either with the rubles or the rupee or the yuan. They're already doing it. Countries are already doing it. Tanzania is already even in that as it is. So, but of course, there are also the other side of it. So the ruble, for instance, has a limited coverage area, you know, and then even the yuan. And, you know, countries like Nigeria try to have an agreement or arrangement with China so we could have that currency engagement and not have to resort to the dollar, which is like a third party if Nigeria is going to deal with China. But it wasn't a very successful one. So, I mean, find a lot of questions there with all of this. But it's something that is already going on. It is if it will become universal. For instance, if OPEC Plus agrees to it, if they start doing that, then we're seeing some sort of acceptance to that. But on the other hand, we do not expect the United States to just sit down and fold their hands. Because it's going to affect them. It's going to affect their dominance. And we know that China has been aiming to be the world #1 for a long time. You know, so and it's going to affect countries like Nigeria. Our reserves are in the dollar. So if this happens, that means the value of the dollar is going to drop. Our reserves will drop. It might also be good for us on the other side because our debts will also drop. But then what do we use to pay the debt is also from the reserve, which would have dropped. It's going to affect a whole lot of countries, especially emerging economies. We import a lot. We use the dollar a lot. We deal with crude oil and all of that, and they're all priced in dollar. Gold is priced in dollar. There's
a reason they call it the almighty dollar, which I take exception to. But the war in Ukraine is doing something to the Russian working population.
Yes, it is. Well, that's right on the surface. President Putin is asking, I think, for about 400,000 recruits, new recruits. Obviously, they'll be Russian. I don't think a lot of Nigerians will want to go and do that. And this mostly are people in the working population. Now, we know there's been a lot of exodus of businesses from Russia. With that, you also have some Russians. The other day, we're talking about the working class that have gone to countries like Hungary and all of that to set up a new lifestyle. These are members of the working population. Businesses have gone. ICT experts have left. Now, the leftover of Russians are being recruited for the war. So who is doing business in Russia? Who is left to actually run the economy? Who is left to work in the manufacturing, the transport, and all of that? That is one headache that, I mean, they've been very...
That's a big question.
Yeah, it is. They've been very good in managing the monetary and finances and all of that, but this might take them a longer time because also attracting, like what the US or Canada do, they tell you, oh, they have a green visa, a green passport, and all of that, might be difficult for Russia. But I don't know if you want to go there.
I'm just going to step back so that business morning can start right now.
Okay, all right.
Ini John Mekwa. Now, the steady stream of wounded soldiers into clinic for artificial limbs in Kiev is a stark reminder of the human cost of Russia's war on Ukraine, where military casualties are a secret closely guarded by both sides. And to the International Olympic Committee, which have recommended the return of Russian and Belarusian athletes to international sporting events as neutrals. Now, after they were banned from the competitions in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year, the IOC said on Tuesday its advice to the governing bodies of Olympic sport does not concern the participation of athletes and their support at the Olympic Games Paris 2024 or the Olympic Winter Games Cortina 2026. Athletes performing from Russia and Belarus were banned from competing in international sporting events following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by neighboring Russia in February 2022. Belarus was also used as a key starting area for Russia's invasion. And Berlin has criticized a recommendation from Olympic chiefs that Russian and Belarusian athletes return to competition as individuals under a neutral flag with no links to the military. It called the decision a slap in the face of Ukrainian athletes. The German sports minister, Nancy Faeser, in a statement, says that Ukrainian athletes deserve the solidarity of international sport. And that's where we leave it for this special coverage of Russian invasion. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.